a zippy little, happy little thing, isn't it? All right, are you ready to have your minds blown? Yes. It's quite the promise. I mean, okay, all right, here it goes. I don't know. This morning, we're going to continue in the series that Jason started last week called Different. And Jason talked last week about the reality of that this world is not our home, and that there are trials and there's suffering that comes with that, and those things have the potential to draw us closer to God. And this morning, we're going to talk about this reality that as people who follow the way of Jesus, we're called to worship. We're called to be a people of praise, of singing, of crying out to God and offering ourselves to Him in worship. And that's something that makes us a little bit different from the world around us. I know that worship is a pretty complex thing, and it can be really, really vast and broad, and there are a lot of different ways that you can look at it, like how serving God in the way that I live day in and day out is truly an expression of worship, or intentionally honoring God with my time, my talents, my possessions. They're also ways to show gratitude to God for what He's done for me. But this morning, what I want to focus on is this idea of worship as singing, as actual singing. Because I think that the idea of pouring ourselves out and responding to God through this act of singing deserves a little bit deeper understanding and a little bit of thought and clarity, because it's really important. Worship is something that I care deeply about. It's one of the things at Brookview that I get to spend time thinking about and engaging in and learning about and wrestling through this question of, why do we do this? Why does it matter that we do it? Why does it matter to God? Why should it matter to me, outside of the fact that I simply like music and I like to sing? Now, something that you might not know about me is that when I was a little girl, I loved to sing. I sang all the time, and I must have sung very unreservedly, because I still remember my dad and my brothers constantly saying, "Jenny," that's what they called me then, "stop singing, you're terrible." I think I must have been a little bit tone deaf, and because during my growing up formative years, my mom wasn't really in the picture, my house was this environment of masculinity, with my dad, who, as Jason mentioned last week, is a man's man, like grunting, groaning, tractors, hunting, all that. And then I'm sandwiched in the middle of two boys, one that's 15 months older than me, and then one that's 3 years younger than me. So our house didn't really have a lot of deep expressions of emotions, and we definitely had a lot of really curt, honest truth-telling about whatever was going on. In recent years, my dad often comments in remorse, "I cannot believe that I did that to you. I can't believe that I said that to you. That was so terrible of me." The good news is, though, I didn't really feel beaten down at all. In this arena, I was completely clueless, and no truth-telling about how awful I was going to keep me from my love of singing terribly at the top of my lungs, wherever I was, and I don't really know why that was. But as I've considered some things about worship, I'm wondering if this act of singing was actually born out of something that I was created to do, that we were all created to do, as a way of responding to God and who He is. I find that music is a powerful thing. It can stir emotions within me in a way that intensifies simply because there's a score, or there's a song to go with them, and it invites those emotions out into the present. It's not just worship music. I mean, think of love songs. I remember in middle school, I was going through a breakup with a boyfriend. It was pretty intense, I know, right? I just wanted to sit in my room and grieve over my loss by playing every sappy love song on the top 40 list and just lamenting and sitting with my deep feelings of loss over this great love in 7th grade. Brooklyn, you would never do that, would you? Never. Well, you can. I've just given you permission. But another example, in high school and early college, I had this friend, Patrick, who was totally into being buff. I mean, the guy was ripped. Like, I remember someone saying, like, Patrick just goes thunder and lightning. I mean, just had these biceps that were like, whoa. And he was totally into working out. He was just generally a pumped up guy. He played football at PLU, and generally speaking, he was intense and focused. And he would make these mixtapes. Do any of you know what I'm talking about? A mixtape? Okay, all right, good. There were these cassette tapes, and you could pop them in your stereo or your boom box and record whatever mix of music that you wanted onto them. It was the mid-90s version of a Spotify playlist. And he labeled these mixtapes Power Tape. Number 1, 2, 3, 4. And he had like 30 of them. And he would carry them with us in the car in this big case when we would make a 4-hour drive together every summer from Bellingham to Randall, Washington, which is by Mount Rainier, to be summer camp counselors. And while we were driving, he would make statements like, I'm really feeling Power Tape number 8 right now. Like, in all seriousness, because he was an intense guy. No joking was happening with him. And into the cassette player that happened to be in the glove box of my car, which was a 1979 butter yellow Toyota Corolla. I mean, classy. And we'd roll our windows down because 80 plus degrees is hot in the summer in that little car with no air conditioning. And we'd blast Power Tape number 8 or whatever the vibe of the moment was, whatever he was feeling, and drive a little bit too fast and get totally pumped up and lost in the energy of whatever was on that Power Tape, which usually included some AC/DC. Music is powerful. It's powerful. Think of musical scores in movies or TV shows. They stir us. We become connected with the emotion of what we're watching in deeper, more intense ways, in ways that I don't think we would if the music wasn't there. In reading the Bible, we can also see that music is not confined to our modern day, this time and space that we find ourselves living in. Music has been around for a very long time. We have an entire book of Psalms, of spiritual hymns, that God's people long before us were using to remember who God is and to cry out to him in song, to surrender to him, to be reminded of who he is, to be encouraged, to beg him for justice, to recognize his unfailing love, to engage with him in deeper ways. And they used music to do that. And as much as we know that music is powerful, and I think that all of us have likely experienced some powerful emotion or connection that music was a part of, whether it was spiritual or not, I think that worship in our present culture can sometimes be a bit challenging to truly engage in. It can feel awkward. Maybe you're thinking, I just want to hear a message that I can apply to my life. I just want to, is all the singing really necessary? Are we just filling time because it's weird to only come here for 40 minutes? So music is kind of our way of filling some of those spaces so it goes a little bit longer. I mean, what if you aren't really a music person? What if you don't really like to sing? And I think all of those are valid thoughts. So I want to spend some time this morning thinking about and talking through some reasons that we engage in singing here at Brookview on Sunday mornings. Why does worship matter? What is it about this space when we come together and we engage in something as simple and, let's be honest, sometimes as insignificant feeling as a song? Why is God so insistent that his people be people who know how to worship? Because the reality is, God doesn't need it. He doesn't need us to worship him. God doesn't have this Tinkerbell syndrome. If you remember the story of Peter Pan, Tinkerbell has to be believed in or she starts to die. God isn't like that. He doesn't need to be reminded that he's worthy. He doesn't need to be reminded that he's holy, that he's majestic, because he is. He is separate from that. So why do we sing? Why do we sing? Well, one thing is because I think that we need to be reminded. We are the creatures that were created for worship, yet so often we can forget that. Now, for many of us today, and I can certainly slip into this, our practical understanding, not on a theological level, but in terms of our practice of worship, we swing between two extremes on a pendulum. On one side, we have worship in practice as kind of the 2 songs before and the 4 songs after a message, so kind of uppers and the downers of the corporate Christian experience. It's like the ramp up and then the cool down, or we swing over here to this side and we talk about worship as our whole life. We define worship in terms of the way that we live day to day and we walk in the world, that this is the expression of our relationship with God. And both of these things are true. They're absolutely true. But when we only see worship in these 2 extremes, one is reductionary on its own, and one is generic and kind of vague. And so we have this potential to lose the depth and the breadth of what worship can be and what worship should be in this space between those 2 opposite polar sides. And so my hope for us this morning is that we would reacquaint ourselves and we would learn together what worship as singing is. And I want to dive into what our picture might be when we talk about and think about worship. So let's launch it. First, I want to start by talking through a few cultural realities that make worship particularly challenging in our day and age, this time and space that we find ourselves living in. And here's why. Because we live in this vortex. We're constantly being drawn into, or at least impacted by the cultures of this world, what's going on in our world today. In the book of Romans, chapter 12, Paul writes, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." So I want to talk for a minute about and think about some of the possible internal resistances within us when we talk about the posture and the practice of worship as singing that come into play because of this world that we live in. And then we're going to look at the ways that worship combats or fights against those cultural realities and the powerful means that we have through something as simple as singing that offers us a way to engage with God. So in addressing the cultural stuff, I don't think this is going to come as a surprise to any one of you, but we live in an age of entertainment. Am I right? Yeah. In LA, they've started putting up billboards that are like movies on billboards on the side of the freeway. And now there's this whole legal battle going on as to whether or not those should be allowed, because it's essentially like a TV show on the side of the freeway while you're driving. But I think it's this great example of the reality that we're surrounded by entertainment. We have Netflix, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, podcasts, audiobooks, the news, TV shows, the ability to DVR and binge watch just about anything, anytime that we would want to. It's just like a wash of kind of chaos and entertainment flying at us and at our fingertips anytime we want it. And you know what's so great about entertainment and what I can really like about it is that it can offer us these kind of pseudo experiences from the comfort and the safety of our couch or in our cars or on our screens in front of us. This idea that I don't have to do anything. I don't have to change anything about myself, but I get to feel this excitement, this intrigue, this emotional thrill of whatever it is that's entertaining me at any given moment. In 1985, Neil Postman wrote a book warning people about the effects that TV was having on our culture. And just to kind of get a sense of the technology that existed at that point, this was 5 years before email, about 10 years before cell phones. So when he wrote it, there were 10 years after, there were flip phones that you only used to make phone calls and nothing else. And then 20 years before Facebook. So just kind of picture that. He's talking about TV. And in this book, Postman wrote, it was called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And here are some of the things that he had to say that I think are pretty relevant 35 years later. The television is devoted entirely to supplying its audience with entertainment. The average length of a shot on network television is only 3.5 seconds. The eye never rests and has always something new to see. It offers a variety of subjects that require minimal skills to understand and is aimed at emotional gratification. There is no great religious leader who offered people what they want, only what they need. But television is not well suited to offering people what they need. Postman proposed in his book that we're having such a delightful time surrounded in every moment by distraction and entertainment, and that while that could in some ways be considered an okay thing, we're starting to overdose on it. That we are reaching the point where the impulse for entertainment is becoming kind of toxic to us. Neil Postman passed away in 2003. A year before Facebook launched, and he never experienced a world with Netflix, Instagram, Snapchat, and Twitter being popular forms of entertainment. And I just wonder what he might have said about the entertainment culture that we're living in today. The reality is that with entertainment, we're constantly bombarded with a flood of information and imagery. But often there's no time for reflection, for careful thought, for serious study. And one of the downsides of entertainment is that it's inactive. It's passive by nature. It gives us something to talk about, to enjoy, but more often than not, it doesn't lead to any meaningful action. And that might be part of why we love it and we're drawn to it. I think I am. In the midst of our busy, complicated life, it doesn't require anything of me. I can go to entertainment as a way of enjoying or getting caught up in an alternate reality. I might use it to fill a void because my life is unexciting. Or I might use it as a way to avoid the tough stuff going on. Because the reality is that being entertained is easy, it's predictable, and it can offer us an escape. We might listen to the radio or read tweets or see an article on Facebook or listen to a podcast and feel like really up to date about politics and the things that are going on in our state or in our world. But yet, statistics show that most people don't even show up to vote. But we all know all about what's going on. We're just not doing anything with that information. Or I can get really into house design and fix-up shows on Netflix. Anyone there with me on that one? Yeah. And I get caught up in imagining how cool it could be to have a beautiful kitchen with whitewashed wood floors and fresh, sparkly, clean white cabinets, no fingerprints, gorgeous marble countertops. And I can spend an entire evening watching these shows to avoid cleaning my own house and scrubbing some of those fingerprints off the cabinets and putting away the laundry that I folded. And there's a disconnect. What I'm actually going to do with any of the entertainment that I just experienced. I mean, really, outside of wishing I had time and money to buy all of the things, there's probably nothing I'm doing with that outside of being entertained. And that's not terrible. But when that is the majority of the way that we spend our time, it's something to kind of think about a little bit. And here's where this age of being entertained all the time can seep into my church experience. I can show up at church on a Sunday and I can hear a message about forgiveness, and I can feel this wash with the reality that I'm forgiven. All the while I am holding on really tightly to bitterness that I hold towards my spouse or a family member or a friend, and I leave with no plan of action in mind because I'm conditioned to be entertained and not to act. Because in an entertainment economy, I've been conditioned to consume, and then I leave. No action required. And so the cycle can begin in us, where entertainment or distraction without involvement or investment, and if I'm not invested, then more often than not, I can become more distracted, more apathetic, and that disconnection can create a cynicism within me about whatever is entertaining me at any given moment. And this cycle slips into the church so easily, which leads to the second cultural comment that I want to make. In addition to this age of entertainment, we live, I think, under this pervasive spirit of skepticism. Dallas Willard, a Christian author and philosopher, writes, "We live in a culture that for centuries now has cultivated the idea that the skeptical person is always smarter than the one who believes." In a place like the Pacific Northwest, where I live, I think this is especially true. I find this to be true. Now, there's a place for wrestling and doubt. I don't want to dismiss that. But skepticism, as we see it today in our culture, this kind of cynical distrust of everything and everyone, most often manifests from this need that we feel to defend our individuality. I'm unique. And it's a way of avoiding or dealing with unanswered questions or insecurities that I might feel. But the problem with skepticism, or in our hyper-intellectual modern world, is that when it seeps in here into the church, it leaves very little room for wonder, for hope, for faith, for joy, for the possibility of, I wonder what God is going to do this morning. I want us to be aware of these two things, entertainment and skepticism within our culture, because they can be destructive to how we worship and this idea of what biblical worship might be. They center on self. They're passive. And they're far removed from the call of Jesus in Mark 12 that challenges us to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all of your strength. And yet, that's the very epicenter of what you and I are called into when we're called into worship. We're called into heart, mind, strength, our entire bodies in abandon, and sometimes undignified adoration and praise of our Creator. And so we walk in on a Sunday morning and we feel the irreconcilable nature of things within us, and they can clash so perfectly in worship We want to encounter God. We want to encounter God. But within the context of the world that we find ourselves living in, we're conditioned to just be entertained. We want to believe, we want to have faith, but we're also suspicious of anyone or anything that seems too eager. And so we find ourselves as Christ followers in this modern world at a crossroads. Will we be people who give ourselves to the biblical practice of worship? Heart, soul, mind, body. Or do we simply want bigger programs, better bands, brighter lights, cooler effects, because we want this church experience to cover up our inability to engage intimately and personally with the person and presence of God Almighty? And you know what I think is just challenging about this? If we don't learn how to worship here in this space, around people of like-mindedness, what happens on a Friday night or Saturday morning when you sit on your own or you're sitting with your family? Do you know how to engage in private praise or adoration or exaltation of God? A.W. Tozer said this: the church that can't worship must be entertained. He saw two options before us. Do we choose to continue in the passivity of our culture, being made numb by our own consumption? I'm just going to take what makes me feel good. Or do we accept an invitation that is offered us over and over and over again in the Bible? We find invitation repetitiously in the book of Psalms. Come before him with joyful songs. Shout to the Lord, all the earth. Worship him with gladness. Know that the Lord is good. It's he that made us, and we are his people. Psalm 9, I will give thanks to you, Lord, with all my heart. I will tell of your wonderful deeds. I will be glad and rejoice in you. I will sing the praises of your name, O Most High. You turned my wailing into dancing. You removed my sackcloth and clothed me with joy, that my heart may sing your praises and not be silent. Lord, my God, I will praise you forever. Come, let us worship and bow down. Come, let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God, and we are his people. This is what worship invites us into. Come and find rest. Come and find identity. Come and find truth. Come and worship the living God, and in so doing, you will know who you are, what it is you were created for, because where the world offers us this passive entertainment that requires no real action, because for the most part, it isn't real. Godly worship offers us a chance to experience something absolutely and truly real. In preparing for this message, I read an article that put it like this: worship is a disciplined and deliberate adventure into reality. Worship is a disciplined and deliberate adventure into reality. Here's why. I want to dive into a story in Luke 19. Some context. This is the moment where Jesus is entering back into Jerusalem. It's the Sunday before Easter, Palm Sunday, where people have lined the streets and they're waving palm branches and shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, which is kind of Matthew's account of the story. But I want to read it out of Luke, who tells it from a little bit different perspective. In your Bible, it might be called the triumphal entry, but really it was just Jesus on a donkey riding into Jerusalem. Not super triumphant. Like when I think triumphant, I think of what's that one? Robin Williams is the genie. Aladdin, yeah. Prince Ali, handsome is he, Ali. And he's on the elephant, and no, this was Jesus on a mule riding into Jerusalem. So we're going to pick up from verse 36. It says, as he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. When he came near the place where the road goes down to the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully praising God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. I tell you, he replied, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. Here you have the Pharisees who are steeped in skepticism. They're trying to silence the extravagant worship of the disciples who had been with Jesus. They saw him heal the sick and give sight to the blind, and he'd been teaching and loving them in such a way that they all began to believe and see that he was the Messiah, the Son of God, and they knew that he was worthy of worship, and they entered into it. Kind of cool. And yet the Pharisees are like, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. They shouldn't be doing that. What a missed opportunity they had. I want to take a little shift. I think I just put it in third gear, didn't I? That was so the Toyota Corolla, butter yellow, also not an automatic. So that makes it extra cool. Okay, the shift. There's something that is a little bit mind-blowing to me, okay? Mind-boggling when we worship. We're joining in a chorus that existed a very long time before us and will continue into eternity. And it's this beautiful thing that we've been invited into here on earth, and it's just kind of crazy to think about. I can't really even begin to grasp it. Our worship, when we sing in song, it joins in with all that God has made, like the rocks crying out, all of his creation. And at the same time, here we are, my little self, personally communing with God. That is just me and him. And it's this two things there. And something happens within us when we echo with all that is singing the praises of God. Think about John's revelation in the book of Revelation, where he sees the heavenly host singing, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. And when we gather together on a Sunday morning and when we join in worship, it's like the eternal song that has been happening long before us. Moses, King David, Esther, Peter, John, Paul, those people are still likely singing. And there are voices that are crying out in Haiti, in Russia, in Mexico, and they join with our voices right here at Brookview Church in Briar. And our hearts postured toward our Creator are just colliding in this beautiful, unending anthem of worship. I can't, it's so cool. It's so cool. Why do we get to do that? What a privilege. Worship's not just something that we reserve for our mind and our thoughts. Guys, it needs to be in our souls, in our very physical being. Think about when you sing worship songs. It's this moment where your mind, where some sort of cognitive thing is taking place, and it's being pushed into the chambers of your body, and then sound is coming out. It's like your very flesh and blood are now participating in a truth that you know about God. There's a physical reality in worship, which means that when we worship God, it's not just mentally. It's not just with my mind. It's with our very bodies. And the Bible actually is filled with this idea. Unfortunately, sometimes we lose some things when the Bible is translated into English. But there's a physicality about our worship, when it's talked about in the Bible. One of the words that's used over and over again in Hebrew when they translate it to this word worship is a word that actually means prostrate, to lie, to bow before, to lie down and bow before. The word blessing means to kneel. The word thanksgiving means to raise your hands. And so all of those things, worship, blessing, thanksgiving, they have corresponding physical action related to them. And so when we talk about pushing back the tides of entertainment and consumption in the church, it's not just a mental thing. There's a physical, tangible way in which we engage with that. Our bodies become the means with which to cultivate this. Now, I realize that for some of us, our preference might be to engage in sort of a non-physical, non-demonstrative worship. You just want to sit there and kind of allow the words to sink in. And I get that. The thought of laying down in church is like, yikes. I mean, I feel that. I get it. And I want you to hear me. I am not dictating a physical demonstration. We don't need to get crazy with this. The reality is there's a tension to manage, okay? We're still in community, worshiping with other people around us. At Brookview, I want us to be a church where we go all out in worship. But then there's this other desire that I'm holding in tension with that. I don't want to freak people out. I mean, they're who are just beginning to pursue God in this space because we want to be warm and welcoming and inviting to those people. And because, hypothetically speaking, what if my deep connection to God draws me to want to swing from all of these light fixtures? Okay, there's a tension to manage. Probably not. I'm probably going to have to hold back in that arena. Here's the reality. We don't want our expression to God to be distracting to other people. So we have to hold this in tension. It's real. But what I do long for is for you to experience authentic worship that is between you and God, that has an element of reckless abandon, that's undignified just a little bit, but also on the other hand, being mindful of the reality that we are in community together. I have to be mindful of worshiping so loud that the person next to me can hear nothing but me. We're still a choir of voices joining together. And yes, we want to sing it out, everyone singing out, not just those with pretty voices. And we need this physicality in worship because there's something that happens when our mind and our bodies are engaged. And the reality is that some of those expressions that I might be drawn to might be best poured out to God in my home, in private, beautiful, just you and me God worship. Sunday mornings here at Brookview don't have to be the only place that we're worshiping. All of that to say, I don't think there's a perfect formula to follow or a checklist of to-dos and don't-dos in worship. The last thing I want us to do is be looking around going, oh, do they love God? I don't know. She didn't have her hands up. That's not what I'm wanting. I just want us to ponder a bit, to take some time to think about our physicality in worship. I don't think that the physical is always needed, but I do want to be bold enough to ask the question, can it be considered praise and worship in the biblical sense if it only ever engages my mind? Step back for a minute. Imagine for a second that I was talking about my relationship with Jason, my hunka burnin' love over there that normally talks to you every Sunday. And I'm describing our relationship to you. And we've been married for almost 22 years this June. Yeah, and we are so in love. We are passionate about each other on this deep cognitive level. Like, our minds are just so passionate, but neither one of us is really demonstrative. So we don't really believe in physical affection. So, kissing, holding hands, anything intimate. So it's just really not a part of our marriage. We have the kind of I Love Lucy marriage, 2 twin beds with a nightstand between us. And it's like, good night, dear. And the lights go out. Okay, as I'm describing that to you, hopefully you're thinking, there's something wrong with their marriage, right? Right? Okay, good. I'm glad that at least you are with me, babe. You are with me. I don't know how things operate with all of you, but if that's how it goes, I think we'd all kind of sense that, there's some sort of disconnect happening in that relationship. And yet, how often do we only offer God our mental affection? It's like everything else in our lives and bodies are set aside, but God, I'll give you my cognitive affection. And I think, unfortunately, specifically with worship, so much of the practice of worship, our posture, how we engage with it, has been overly determined by church culture, maybe specific to church movements that you grew up in. I grew up in a really conservative church. Like, you would never put your hands up in worship. And so that kind of determines what we're comfortable with rather than what we see biblically. Think about that story of David, like in his loincloth dancing, and like, I'll become even more undignified than this. No, really think about that. I'll become even more undignified than this. Think about being completely undignified because you're so enraptured with the presence of God. I mean, that's kind of a mind-blowing thing. And it stretches every ounce of comfort in me. And I'm not sure I'm ready to say and act like that. And yet we see it in the Word of God. And so here sits this invitation to a deliberate and disciplined adventure into reality. That's what we're invited into. Some of you might be sitting here thinking, I'm starting to sweat. What is worship going to look like now that these permissions have been given? And we've talked about this. If the goal is to become undignified, don't worry. It makes me nervous too. Here's what I'm not saying. Go crazy. We're going to start barking in the Spirit. And if doing cartwheels down the aisle is your way of going all out in your worship, do it. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is, if worship is only ever in your mind, is there an appropriate way for you to engage your body? For some of you, it might simply be singing, because you don't normally sing. For some of you, it might be raising your hands. For some of you, it might be sitting and bowing or kneeling right at your chair, maybe going in the lobby. For some, the reality is that it's important that we find appropriate physical ways to engage in worship, to step into it a little bit more fully. I've heard worship defined this way. Worship is a response to an encounter with God. Worship is a response to an encounter with God. That's why we order our service the way that we do. We've thought about this a bit. We allow you to kind of settle in and to begin to think about who God is with a couple of songs in the morning. And then the message is shared. And then after the message is our opportunity to respond, to engage with God in what we've heard. A really beautiful example of someone engaging in worshiping Jesus in a physical way is found in the book of Luke. I know Jason talked about this a couple of weeks ago in his message, so I won't go into the story in depth, but it's the account of the sinful woman anointing Jesus' feet. And here's this room of people. You can imagine the Pharisees sitting there in judgment and ridicule. And she comes in. In verse 37, a woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. And she stood behind him at his feet weeping. She began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. And the Pharisees are sitting there ridiculing her extravagance. They're sitting there in judgment of her gift because she is a sinner who should not be with Jesus. But I want to look at what Jesus says, skipping down to verse 44. Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she's poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little, loves little. Then Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. That to me is a beautiful example of when love and adoration just overflowed in this woman. And she set aside the opinions of others. She set aside the scoffing. Can you imagine her walking into that room and the judgment that she felt from people around her? And she brought everything she had and she gave it to Jesus in adoration and worship and in praise and in response. Sometimes worship feels costly. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's like it's this uphill practice. Sometimes it's like, man, I know that this is important, but I'm just not feeling it today. But if I'm deliberate and disciplined and I take some time to stop and enter into the depth of God's love for me, in spite of my brokenness, my sin, my humanity, when I take time to really sit with my need for forgiveness, remembering how undeserving I am of his grace. It's in those moments that simply being entertained, it's not enough. I don't want to sit passively by. I want to engage fully and completely in the reality that the living God is here in my midst, that my heart, soul, mind, and body are communing with him. I'm called to pour everything out. And when I do, when I experience the presence of the living God, when I allow that reality, or when I'm at the feet of Jesus and the truth of who he is pours over and out of the chambers of my body and the tears start making that song difficult to sing, it's beautiful and it's special. And I crave more of it, and I'm thankful, so thankful for it. As most of you already know, because Jason has talked about it a bit, for the past year and a half, our family's been walking through a season that's felt heavy and hard and just kind of broken and outside of the realm of my control. I just feel helpless to do anything. But in moments when I fix my gaze on who Jesus has been, how good he's been to me, there's something that wells up in me that begs a response. Worship to me has been really powerful in this season, and very often while I'm listening to a song, I get this peace that washes over me, or this joy that I can't explain, or this feeling that God is right there looking at me. And it's this sense of knowing that God sees me, and it's something that's deep and very real, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. There was this particular day a while back where God's presence was just incredibly tangible. It was about a year and a half ago. It doesn't matter. I don't know why that matters in this moment. I'm just losing my mind. I better take a drink of water. This is where I start embarrassing my children, because they know that I have this filter that when I'm tired or up here, it doesn't really work. And so Cam's on the edge of his seat going, come on, Mom, pull it together. You got this. You've got this. Okay, where was I? Okay, yes, the time frame, about a year ago. Yeah, there I am. I was driving in the car with my daughter, Kate, and it was shortly after Chris Perry had gone to be with Jesus, and things were just emotionally hard. It was hard. It was difficult to comprehend the loss of a friend. It was agonizing to watch Alicia and her girls walk into the dark reality of life without him and the grief of that. And then in this same space and time, running simultaneously, our son, Cam, was going through some tough stuff. And I honestly thought that we were going to lose him. I was just feeling helpless and just broken inside in a way that I never have before. And I was pulling up to a stoplight on our drive home on a rainy, gross day in January. And there was this moment where time just seemed to stand still, one that I hope I'll never forget. Kate and I had been listening to one of her worship playlists, and as we rolled up to that stoplight, we were coming to the end of the song, No Longer Slaves. And if you know that song, the lyrics, I'm no longer a slave to fear. I'm a child of God. And it was piercing through me, and I was kind of feeling this getting all choked up, which for some of you that know me is not a super common occurrence for me. God just didn't wire me that way. I tend to be a lot of action and movement without a lot of stopping for pause, which is not a super great thing. And so when I start getting choked up, it's like, whoa, pay attention. Something really big is about to go down here. But anyway, we're sitting at this stoplight on the Mukilteo Speedway, almost to our house. And in that moment, as the song's ending, the sun's rays broke through the dark, dreary day, and a rainbow emerged. And then this next song started kind of shouting through the speakers of my car to me. And it was Torrin Wells' song, Hills and Valleys. And if you don't know the song, hear the lyrics. I've watched my dreams get broken. In you I hope again. No matter what, I know I'm safe inside your hand. On the mountains, I will bow my life to the one who set me there. In the valley, I'll lift my eyes to the one who sees me there. When I'm standing on the mountain, I didn't get there on my own. When I'm walking through the valley, I know I'm not alone. You're a God of the hills and valleys, and I'm not alone. And Kate and I just sat there with tears just streaming down our faces. We caught each other's glance, and there weren't any words. We just cried. And then we laughed uncomfortably at the fact that we were crying, because that's what us Huguenon girls do. And it was this moment that we got to share together, and it was beautiful. And I don't know what was beautiful about it for her, but for me, it was God shouting in the midst of the pain, remember the rainbow? Do you remember how that was a sign of a promise that I made to people a long time ago? Do you remember how that doesn't change? Remember that I don't change. I've got you. I see you. You're not alone. I'm the same on the highest mountain when things are going really great, and I'll be the same in the lowest valley of your life. Nothing has changed. I won't change, Jen. And it's in moments like those, and many of you know what I'm talking about because you've also experienced them. It's those moments that when we stand them next to the idea of simply being entertained and thinking some good thoughts about God and then sitting back passively by, it's those moments, it's that connection of heart, soul, mind, body, those experiences, guys, those are the antidote to simply being entertained. Quickly, the last thing I want to talk about is this spirit of skepticism and how I think the antidote to that can be holy expectation. To launch into this idea, I want to take a look at a passage in John chapter 4. This is the moment where Jesus is talking with a Samaritan woman at a well. You might be familiar with it. He's talking with her about the idea that there's this spring of water welling up, and that those who drink from it will have eternal life. So we're going to pick that story up in verse 19. "Sir," the woman said, I can see that you're a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth." The woman said, "I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, am he. I am he. A time is coming and has now come." Holy expectation in worship. When you read through the Old Testament, there are a lot of references to the temple and priests and the Holy of Holies, and some of that is what Jesus is referring to here. This idea that in the past, worship was limited. It was designed for a specific place, the temple in Jerusalem. We definitely see this as we read the stories of the Israelites and what God asked of them in worship. But I want to kind of take a minute to quickly rewind kind of all the way back to the beginning, where Adam and Eve were created, and they were the image bearers of God. They were communing with him without separation, without sin. And then, unfortunately, the fall happened. Sin entered into the picture, and that communion was severed. It was broken. But God, in his faithfulness, as we travel forward to the book of Exodus, he calls the people together and they build this tabernacle. And it's the place that's been created and set apart where once again there's communing with God. But the thing about the tabernacle is that only Aaron and his sons, the priests, actually had access to the presence of God. And so for the rest of the Old Testament, this is the habit of worship for the people of Israel. We have to go to the temple, and we can never actually be in the presence of God. It is only the priests that enter into the Holy of Holies. But then think about what Jesus says in John 4. A time is coming and has now come where the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. And then Paul kind of solidifies the truth of what Jesus was saying, and he writes to the church in Ephesus, and he tells them about how God's purpose was to unite all things, heaven and earth, once again. Think about that image in Genesis where Adam and Eve are in the garden and they're communing with God. God's purpose was to unite all things, heaven and earth, together once again. Jews and Gentiles coming together as one body. And in talking to the Gentiles in Ephesus, Paul says, "You are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him, you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. In him, you too are being built together to become a dwelling place in which God lives by his Spirit." What this means is that you and I are the new temples of God. None of us lived through the separation that the people of Israel would have. That kind of defining line. There was this place in the temple, the Holy of Holies, where God's presence dwelled, and the only ones that had access to God's Spirit and his presence was the priests. Like, this far and no further can you go when you enter into the temple. But just imagine that change taking place. The Samaritan woman is being told that she can't worship where she worships, that it's not right, that the Spirit is only accessible at the temple through the priests. And then suddenly, at the death of Jesus, the temple shakes and the veil is torn in two, and the Spirit of God is poured out on all the people. And now, not just Aaron and his descendants, but you and me. We are the royal priesthood, a holy people set apart, able to bear his image, free to worship wherever we want. And wherever we are, God is dwelling there too. What? That's awesome. But the problem is that sometimes I have this temptation in me of wanting that old temple. I just want someone to kind of mediate my spirituality for me. It sometimes feels like it would be more convenient. Just kind of show up on a Sunday, have someone kind of do their thing, and I get to walk away feeling like I've done my religious duty. But what Jesus is offering to us is something far more compelling, something far more profound. Think about the book of Acts, the group of Jewish believers who would have lived their whole life being separated from the Holy of Holies, and suddenly the curtain is torn, and that's not just symbolic for them. It's the actualized promise that for the first time, they're going to get to experience the presence of God. And since that moment in time, as Jesus' followers, you and I have the presence of God available to us every single day in every single moment that we live. Holy expectation, when it's cultivated within us, says, I wonder what God's going to do today. And it's not about hype. I hate that. It's not about hype and mustering up inauthentic things. It's about the simple, honest conviction that God is here and he is not silent. How many generations longed for what we have access to now? How many generations longed for the unhindered access to the presence of God? They just wanted a sign. And you and I are now the living signs of the new creation breaking in on earth. Worship is the demonstration that the covenant God has come to dwell among us. And I'm way too guilty of walking around unaware of that reality of what I have. Often when we think about worship, I think we can think about it just like me and God. But here in this space, here at church, when we gather together, when we sing, there is something beautiful that is really personal, but it transcends our individualism. When we gather together in one voice, come, let us worship and bow down. It asks us to be generous with our whole selves. It requires a sacrificial offering sometimes, heart, soul, mind, body. Sometimes in corporate worship, I sing for you because you might need to hear about God's faithfulness and his goodness, his grace. And sometimes I need you to sing for me. I need to be reminded that he's here, that he's not silent, that I need to be reminded that he's faithful, that he's good, that he loves me no matter what. I need to be bathed in the truth of the God that I believe in by standing side by side with all of you and raising my voice along with yours to a God that is present and with us and is worthy of our adoration and our devotion. How do we push back the tides of entertainment and consumption in the church? I think we can start by actively and earnestly engaging in and experiencing the reality of God in our midst. How do we combat cynicism and skepticism from being a part of our worship and our experience here, awe and wonder and expectation when we walk in on a Sunday and we anticipate, I wonder what God might do. That's what we're being invited into. Not ceremony, not religious tradition in a negative sense. It's not routine. It's definitely not the uppers and the downers of the Sunday morning service. It's a practice that has this power to transform us. And our great God deserves it. He deserves it. I'm guessing you might know this, but I want to take some time to worship together. And so I'm going to invite the worship team to come back up. Because honestly, I can't think of a better response to hearing this than to engage in some worship together. And I want to invite you to worship generously in some way. To worship in view of God, who he has come to worship in view of the God who has come to dwell among you. I want you to picture in your mind the heavenly hosts who are singing for all of eternity of his holiness and join in their song. Join in the song of all of creation that's been crying out about their God who made them. Maybe you risk a little. Maybe you've never raised your hands in worship. And this morning is a time where you go, you know what? He's worthy of more than just my mental cognition. He's worthy of every single faculty available to me. I want to read something over us. But as I do, I want to ask you to just kind of close your eyes. I want us to close our eyes because I think it helps us to focus. As much as you can in this moment, breathe in and breathe out again. Try and let the room fade away. The person next to you fade away. And it's you, here in the presence of God, surrounded by his people. And this is our invitation. God desires to take us deeper into himself. We have much to learn about him. He wants to lead us in our love for him who first loved us. He wants to cultivate within us adoration and admiration of which he is worthy. God, we open our hearts to you this morning, and we want to be filled with awe and wonder. The presence of the covenant God is here in our midst, and you are not silent. My eyes have seen the King. The vision of his beauty has pierced me deep within. To whom else can I go? My heart desires him. He's touched something inside of me that's now reaching out for him. And I know that I must go.